Alright, welcome to another driving video. Today I actually am leaning towards discussing the nature of what the so-called elites in our society, who they are, the way that it works, not by name, but just as a class, right? How they tend to operate and why it's incredibly important for us to not only be aware, but start doing things to push back, both for ourselves, for our communities, for our families, for our nation. Because the modern United States and much of the Western world, as an unfortunate byproduct, is under the sway or spell of what is often known as this neoliberal regime and the modern American world order, and kind of a neo-colonialist extraction-based system that is still impacting much of the world that has already been victimized by the West for a long time. And now a good chunk of that model has come home. Not that it ever really left, but it's definitely reasserted itself as the dominant model here in the United States. And funnily enough, one of the most notable bastions of flawed but still pretty robust democracy and economic fairness, if you will, is the European Union. What we went out of our way to split off from and defined ourselves in the United States as being separate from the monarchies over in Europe has now become something of a representation of what the United States could have and should have been. Certainly not perfect. There is no version of a perfect system, at least not in current existence. And as far as I'm aware and concerned, anything involving humans is basically incapable of creating anything we consider perfect. That said, wanted to focus primarily on the U.S. as that's where I'm based. It's what I know the most about, and we do still largely lead the global order as it stands today. So what happens here often impacts the rest of the world, and what seems to have happened is after World War II, obviously the world was kind of reshuffled. The British Empire, which had been the dominant power in the world, was beginning to, and began over the subsequent decade or two, to kind of fold in under itself and accept its status as a declining and decoupling empire, and eventually transitioned into the Commonwealth, right? The Commonwealth of Nations. And that process also saw, as is pretty obvious to anyone watching this video, really, the rise of the United States, right, as a world superpower, and its only real challenger was the Soviet Union. Then, for several decades, we basically had a series of proxy wars in the Cold War with the Soviet Union before it too collapsed and dissolved into a variety of nation states of different sizes, and since the early 1990s have been the sole superpower, so to speak, in the world. And this has led to an interesting series of events. In terms of foreign power, we're still more or less unchallenged, yet we are increasingly seeing, decades on here in the 2020s, that American power very much has its limits. It was brought to kind of harsh attention in the 1960s and 70s while involved in the Vietnam War. It then was re-brought to our attention during and after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the way that neither of those really went the way that any American hoped circa the early 2000s. And Afghanistan was particularly disappointing because the Taliban literally just walked right back into power. And now we're seeing the situation here with Iran, wherein even smaller regional powers can actually put up, if they're willing to, pretty significant fight and resistance against the United States, and China is actively challenging our supremacy in places like the South China Sea in a way that they wouldn't have 10, 20, 30 years ago. The United States, while still growing, still powerful, technically spending more on its military than ever, is in relative terms declining. And it's somewhat inevitable because we have this globalist system that we've been pushing for the better part of the last a little over 80 years now, right? And this globalist system has involved a lot of trade that was designed to enrich all nations that were involved in it. And then we created a variety of institutions to help standardize and enforce rules and facilitate the exchange of currencies and commodities and so on. And then really starting in the 1970s, you saw a political turn in the United States towards a more pro-corporate, anti-tax, against big government kind of regime change in the United States that is generally referred to as neoliberal now, replacing the New Deal order that had emerged under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and had guided the United States through the Second World War and much of the Cold War. But much of the globalism that was in place during the New Deal era was still in place during the neoliberal era. In fact, if anything, initially it doubled down on it. The free trade agreements like NAFTA became a big part of the selling point of globalism in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Now, by the 2020s, where I'm sitting now, the mood in the nation is largely changed. And a lot of us, myself included, are not really a fan of how these free trade agreements have worked out. President Trump, that is, as if there's any other fucking version, unfortunately, has renegotiated, if you want to call it that, NAFTA, I believe, twice now, and called each one prior to the one he most recently negotiated a disaster, even if it was his own, funnily enough. And we're now reinstituting tariffs and, attacking Venezuela and Iran and doing things that are more like early 1900s United States, before we had the responsibilities and the limitations of being a great power but not a world power. That seems to be what we're reverting to acting like. In many respects, we're just throwing away a lot of our soft and hard power. Soft power being diplomatic strength, economic, influence. And meanwhile, you have competitors of ours, such as China, that is playing this game far more intelligently than we are. They are catching up rapidly in a variety of areas. They're instituting strangleholds on various markets such as rare earths and solar panels and development of EVs. They turn entire cities and metro regions into massive industrial complexes designed down to the tenths of a cent to cut costs so that they outcompete everyone around them. They even do it with little Bic, simple lighters, They even do it with that. They do it with e-bikes. They do it all over with a number of different products. And they're very nimble. So as the market changes, they change with it and are able to retool quickly. So while China has its issues, the United States is handing power and know-how and supply chains and so on increasingly to nations outside not only of the United States, obviously, but outside of our core alliance network, outside of the Western Democratic Alliance that we've spent roughly 80 years solidifying, bringing together, standardizing, and so on. And the regime in the United States has really, truly shifted over time to being pretty purely and truly about economic domination of other nations to the best of our ability. And we're taking on some of the worst aspects of reactionary policy towards China and the world in response to China's rise, and ignoring much of what allowed China to do this in the first place, and doubling down on that which allowed and gave China those particular keys to the proverbial kingdom. And the United States and American citizens are suffering for it. So we are seeing a huge amount of wealth being transferred to the top that they're extracting not only from the American people, but people around the world through low wages and disproportionately beneficial trade deals in America's favor. They use the might of the United States government and military and overall presence in the world to benefit themselves, enrich themselves disproportionately to what other mega corporations could even hope to do. And then turn around and leave taxpayers as much as possible with the bill when things go wrong. So it's not actually enriching our nation, even though our GDP numbers might say so. It's actually enriching a core group of publicly traded companies, largely, and investment banks, firms that are largely involved in finance and buying up as much asset, value as possible. And this has resulted in the slow but sure hollowing out of much of the American middle class, American manufacturing, a lot of American education. And then this business interest has allied and used religious groups and organizations, in particular your non-denominational evangelicals, and through the use of things like the prosperity gospel, insisting that if you give God money and you effectively worship or highly praise success, then you will also be successful because God will bless you. And so it helps perpetuate this myth that these mega multi-millionaire pastors with private jets and so on are somehow actually doing the Lord's work, even though almost everything in the Bible would indicate that the opposite is what should be true. That it is more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to go through the eye of the needle, right? And yet that America's inverted that. We've turned it around entirely, and now being financially blessed is what really shows your favor with God. And that's what we should all be striving for as good, evangelicals in the United States. That is now also being pushed very harder than I've really ever seen in my lifetime, to insist that it is truly a Christian nation, even though it's been built on religious pluralism from the beginning, and it's just been a majority Christian nation. Most of its history hasn't even been evangelical as a majority, yet that's where we're at now, and it does seem like there's a pretty solid base that wants to keep it that way for the foreseeable future. And so you have this economic malaise combined with an unholy alliance between business, government, and religion. And you kind of start to see how we're entering increasingly something of a dystopian version of the United States. We're kind of there, but because it's happened so slowly, as an American, it can be hard to see it at times if you're not paying attention. And we honestly don't know how much worse it can get. Maybe things change and voters kind of wake up and we end up choosing some better answers, and politicians end up getting held more accountable and we pass some meaningful reforms, and maybe that eventually does happen, even if things get worse first. Like, there are a variety of versions of a possible future for the United States. And the likelihood is we'll still continue to exist. We'll still be a great power. We'll still have overseas territories. We're unlikely to ever be invaded, etc. Right? The United States is a solid location to host a nation state in general. And it is very easily defensible and has excellent capacity for food production. So, as I've heard before, the statement that the United States is kind of a nation on easy mode, that would appear to be true. So, that said, in relative terms, compared to the rest of the world as a whole, the United States is declining, and we are, if we're even still realistically called a world superpower, we're losing that status fairly quickly. And we're kind of, for lack of a better term, pissing it away, especially under recent presidents, notably the two Trump administrations. And I don't know that Biden was a whole lot friggin' better, even though he did seem to try to bring more investment into things like silicon, manufacturing and manufacturing in general and so on back to the United States. So there are some positives there. Trump really just seems to be really big about dropping taxes, which is, for one who plays as a populist, he doesn't seem to actually do much that is very populist. But anyway, all that to say, our nation is at an interesting inflection point. And I think this unfortunately gets worse before it gets better. Americans will continue to, the majority of us, get poorer functionally, even if the raw dollar amount goes up. Inflation goes up faster almost every year, chipping away at our actual buying power. Corporations, especially those that have consolidated to have only 2 to 4 companies that really control a given industry, function as a de facto monopoly, and they give you the illusion of choice and the illusion of sales or good deals, when in reality making profit margins that their companies have never had before and would never have if there was real competition. And they tell us all this is the American dream, that this is what we should all aspire to, is be good consumers and be good owners of our homes, and except most of us can't, or many of us can't even afford those, and we're struggling to even get into our first home nowadays. And the average age of a first-time home buyer is now approaching 40 years, when as recently as the 1990s it was in the late 20s, right? So it's gone up pretty dramatically in roughly 20 years, 20 to 30 years. It has gone up dramatically. And you see that with the average age of a first child, the number of children people have, the average age of a first marriage, the average amount of savings that Americans have, like amount of money they have saved in their accounts, the amount that they have in their retirements. And we've systematically destroyed defined benefit pensions in favor of your 401k type investment retirements that have overall not been nearly as good for people. Our healthcare has been slowly but surely, year over year, getting worse while also getting more expensive. Our food quality has slowly but surely gotten worse while also getting more expensive. Our infrastructure has been getting worse while the ability to actually build anything has been getting more expensive. So corporate America loves putting up red tape as long as it's not for them. When they keep railing against regulation, it's not regulation to do things that'll actually help the American people. It's regulation that helps them dominate their industries and extract even more profit from an already exploited system. And this is the United States. This is the home of this system. Imagine what they're doing to the rest of the world when they have the opportunity. It's why I think Europe puts such a high emphasis on having a strong regulatory body, because that's the only way you stand up to the United States. And China does the same thing. I think we as Americans need to start trying to change our perspective. This is not the greatest country in the world. We haven't been for a long time, if we ever were. We are the most powerful, but that does not make us the greatest. In terms of per capita income, we're not there. In terms of happiness, we're not there. In terms of overall quality of life or life expectancy, we're not there. In terms of health outcomes, we're not there. We're not in any major category. The United States needs to change its direction. And until we do, this will continue to get worse. And how we start doing that is, one, by taking our own lives back. Things like growing your own food and If you can, homestead, and being aware of your finances and not letting yourself get into debt, right? Or paying off debts as quickly as able, or getting debt that allows you to create income. Things that, like debt that allows you to fund or like giving a down payment, for example, to fund a mortgage on a property that may be a rental or something like that, right? As an example. But even then, we want to be careful, because in the process of creating our own passive income, we're often exploiting others. Like rental properties is a great example. You do one or two, that's cool, that's fine. Everybody, needs a place to live, and having a vibrant rental market is important. But if we're taking up the vast majority with mom and pop rentals, and then the most of the rest are taken up by your corporate um, landlords, what it leaves is a very expensive market for any of the rest of us, that forces us to move into rental properties, and you perpetuate this cycle. And that's kind of where we're at now. That's not to blame it on mom and pops, but starting your own business, adding value, right, to your community, starting your own garden, like I said, homesteading, like my wife and I are working on doing now. um, Trying to raise your kids outside of much of the system as much as possible, but not specifically from a religious perspective, though. If that's how you want to hit it, go ahead, but it's not what's required. It's not about not being of the world. It's acknowledging this is a corrupt system, and there we need to restore collective beneficial values that are not simply empowering the already wealthy and powerful. And we've done it before. We've pushed back against wealthy interests, and I think we'll do it again. It's just a matter of making it happen and getting enough people upset and on the same page that we're actually able to organize and do something. So that's what we're all working on. Part of it is taking your life back and lowering your own expenses and decoupling from the system as it stands, educating ourselves, explaining this to others, and then starting to advocate for positions both politically and economically, and in your own local jurisdictions and in your own families, to change the way that we live and operate. So if you want to hear more about these topics and want to join in on the discussion, stick around, because we'll definitely be talking about it. Later.